12:11 p.m. There is a number stamped into the history of American manufacturing that most people have never heard, and that changes how you think about the country once you have 60 million watches. That is what a single factory in Elgin, Illinois produced over the course of its existence, more than any rival on the continent, more than any watchmaker in the Western Hemisphere. 1 out of every 2 quality American pocket watches bore its name. At its peak, the plant stretched across more than 500,000 square feet, employed over 4,500 workers running day and night shifts, and sent its products to jewelers in London and Hamburg and to the railroad conductors whose pocket watches were the only thing standing between a functioning national rail system and catastrophic collision. By the 1920s, nearly every American jeweler, more than 14,000 shops across the country, sold Elgin. The company did not just make watches. It set the time for an entire nation. And then it was gone. Not overnight. Not in a single dramatic collapse that makes for a clean story. Slowly, then faster, then completely, over the course of 2 decades of policy decisions made in Washington and competitive pressures applied from Geneva, and a fundamental shift in what American consumers wanted from the objects that told them what time it was. In October 1966, 15 explosive charges were detonated against the walls of the main factory, and the building that had sheltered a century of American precision manufacturing came down in a cloud of dust that an Elgin patrolman standing in the crowd later said smelled like memory. The brand survived the building by 2 years. In 1968 it was sold off and applied to imported watches that had nothing to do with the city whose name they carried. This is the story of how that happened. It is also, without anyone intending it to be, a story about what it costs to be excellent at exactly the wrong moment, and about the specific cruelty of watching the government policies that built you become the government policies that bury you. It begins in 1864 with a gamble that a Harper's Magazine writer at the time called the genuine, audacious, self-reliant Western spirit, which is the kind of phrase that sounds like promotional copy and in this case was simply accurate. Chicago investors had decided that if Massachusetts could build watches by machine, then Illinois could build them bigger, and they had put $100,000 and their collective reputations behind that belief. The founders, Benjamin Raymond, Faux Carpenter, Thomas Dickerson, and George Wheeler, needed a factory site large enough to rival anything the East Coast had built, and they needed it quickly. They went to Elgin with a proposition that was really an ultimatum. Donate 35 acres of land or the factory goes somewhere else. The only available parcel was a worn-out 71-acre farm on the east bank of the Fox River. The owners refused to split it. For Elgin, businessmen stepped in, purchased the entire 71 acres for $3,550, and handed over the 35 acres the company required. It was an act of civic faith of the kind that requires a community to believe in something before there is any evidence that belief is warranted. The land deed was signed and construction began on what would become the largest watch factory in the world. But the land was only part of what was needed. Precision watchmaking in 1864 was not knowledge you could find in a library or learn from a diagram. It lived in the hands of specific men who had spent years building the machines and mastering the tolerances that made industrial watchmaking possible. Those men were in Massachusetts, working at Waltham, and they were not going to come to Illinois out of civic enthusiasm. They needed to be purchased. 7 of them were, with an offer that the payroll ledgers of the era record with the matter-of-fact precision of people who know they are doing something historically significant. $5,000 signing bonus. $5,000 a year for 5 years. 1 acre of Illinois land. In 1864 this was a king's ransom for a machinist, and every man offered it understood that accepting meant carrying his expertise across state lines and rebuilding in a new place everything he had spent his career learning. The 7 men who accepted became known as the 7 Stars. They arrived in Elgin carrying knowledge that their former employer in Massachusetts considered proprietary and that the Elgin founders considered the entire foundation of their investment. Charles Moseley, the eldest and most respected, sketched out the first toolroom on a scrap of paper and oversaw the assembly of precision lathes and presses that winter while the factory on the Fox River filled with the noise of hammers and steam. Designs and patterns once locked in Massachusetts workshops reappeared in Elgin, sometimes improved, always recognizable. By April 1867 the first movement, named the B.W. Raymond after company president Benjamin Raymond, left the bench and sold for $17. It was a pocket watch built to railroad standards, which in 1867 meant something specific and demanding. The railroads required accuracy to within 30 seconds per week. A watch that failed that standard caused delays at best and collisions at worst. The B.W. Raymond met the standard. The gamble had produced something real. What followed over the next half-century was the construction of an operation so large and so systematic that it required its own observatory to function properly. This is not a metaphor. In 1910, the Elgin National Watch Company opened an actual astronomical observatory on a rise above the Fox River, the first and only one owned by an American watchmaker. Inside the dome, a 3-inch meridian telescope was mounted on a concrete pier sunk deep into gravel to isolate it from the vibrations of the factory and the city below. Every clear night, the telescope tracked the precise moment that stars crossed the meridian, 11 vertical wires in the eyepiece recording each crossing with a click, each second marked by a flash of light. Beneath the dome, 2 precision clocks sat in a room insulated with tarred paper and hollow tile, their temperature held steady at 81 degrees Fahrenheit by a network of 58 electric bulbs because temperature variation affects timekeeping and nothing at Elgin could be left to variation. The observatory fed a relay network that synchronized the entire factory, from the master regulators in the measurement rooms to the benches of 4,500 workers. The slogan was printed on every box. Elgin takes the time from the stars and puts it in your pocket. The slogan was not marketing language. It was a literal description of the production process. Watches were tested and adjusted and certified against astronomical observation. Advertisements claimed accuracy to the hundredth of a second, a claim that in the age before atomic clocks represented the closest any manufactured object could come to the fundamental precision of the universe. The workforce that operated this system was unusual for American manufacturing of the era in ways that complicate the standard story about who built what in industrial America. By the 1920s, women made up more than half the Elgin workforce. This was not progressive policy for its own sake. It was practical recognition that precision assembly demanded patience and dexterity in equal measure, and that the women who applied for work at Elgin demonstrated those qualities consistently. Setting jewels and fitting gears and inspecting completed movements required a steadiness of hand and a capacity for sustained concentration that the factory's supervisors found more reliably in female applicants than male ones. The work was skilled. The wages reflected it. In 1905, Elgin founded the Watchmakers College, an institution that trained apprentices in metallurgy and mathematics and the delicate art of adjusting a hairspring. Over 40 years, the college graduated more than 5,000 students, many of them women who went on to supervise production lines or return as instructors. The pride in this training was not abstract. It was the specific pride of people who had learned to do something difficult and who knew that the difficulty was the point. An apprentice named Mary L. wrote in her 1915 diary that the tick-tock of the watch was the heartbeat of her family and that every gear she fit felt like a promise to the future. The diary entry has the quality of someone who means exactly what she is saying. The historian Jerry Turnquist later recalled that there was not a family in Elgin that did not have someone working in the factory or know someone who did. The city's rhythm was literally set by the shift change whistle. The company magazine Watchword covered baseball games and marriages and technical achievements with equal seriousness because to the people who read it, all of those things were part of the same life. Then came the war and everything that the war made inevitable. When the United States entered the conflict in 1941, Elgin's factory floor transformed overnight. Watchmakers became defense workers. The benches that had held watch movements were cleared for blueprints for bomb fuses and cockpit chronometers. Civilian watches vanished from the production line. In their place came precision aviation instruments, artillery timers, aircraft altimeters, sapphire bearings for military gun sights. The company's regular output of 1 million watches per year was replaced by a surge of war contracts that pushed the workforce past 5,500 and kept the factory running around the clock. 10 Army Navy E awards arrived in quick succession, each one a blue pennant hung above the shop floor certifying that Elgin's precision met the highest standard of wartime production. The men and women who worked those shifts understood what they were doing and were proud of it. They were also anxious in a way that the pennants and the ceremonies could not fully address. While Elgin was converting every machine to military use, Switzerland, neutral in the conflict, continued shipping watches to American jewelers without interruption. Swiss exporters were not converting their factories to fuse timers. They were filling the display cases that Elgin had abandoned. Customs records from 1946 show a sharp spike in Swiss imports that had been building steadily through the war years. The gap Elgin left in the American market had been filled before the war was over. In May 1942, the Union president at Elgin sent a letter to Congress that captured the anxiety underneath the patriotism. He wrote that the workers stood ready to serve the nation yet felt the walls closing around them. The walls he was describing were not imaginary. Every fuse timer shipped overseas was a civilian market relationship transferred to a Swiss competitor. The sacrifice was total and the cost, though invisible in 1942, was accumulating with the precision of the very instruments the factory was producing. When the war ended, the accounting came due. Swiss imports flooded American jewelry stores with products priced below anything Elgin could match. But the most damaging blow did not come from Geneva. It came from Washington. During the war, tariffs on imported Swiss machine tools had stood at 44%, a protection that maintained Elgin's cost advantage against foreign competition. In 1945, those protections began to unravel. The Post-War Economic Stabilization Act cut tariffs on imported Swiss machine tools from 44% to 10%, a reduction of 34 percentage points that eliminated at a stroke the price differential that had made American watchmaking competitive. Swiss firms, already masters of precision, could now sell their tools and finished watches in the American market at prices that Elgin could not approach. The irony was precise enough to be painful. American policy had helped rebuild European manufacturing capacity after the war, partly for legitimate geopolitical reasons related to the Cold War and partly because the broader principle of open trade had become the framework through which Washington understood post-war prosperity. Within that framework, the specific situation of American watchmakers was not a priority. In 1949, Congress debated a proposal to raise tariffs on Swiss watch parts by 50% to give domestic producers relief. In 1952, President Truman vetoed the measure, citing the risk of a trade war and the need to maintain European allies during the Cold War. The logic was not unreasonable from the perspective of someone managing a global strategic relationship. From the perspective of someone standing at a bench in Elgin, Illinois, it meant that the government, which had demanded total conversion to war production, was now declining to provide the protection that would allow recovery from that conversion. Trade Commission records from 1947 chart the slide with the same precision that Elgin's observatory once applied to stellar observation. American market share in jewel watches falling month by month. Swiss shipments rising to fill the space. The factory that had once set the national standard for accuracy now struggled to compete on price with products manufactured on machine tools that American trade policy had allowed to cross the Atlantic.